Hello, my name is Aude Oliva, and I will present an introduction to deep convolutional neural networks. So here are examples of biological brains, including an illustration of the human brain, as well as an illustration of a few modern artificial neural networks. These artificial neural networks have achieved outstanding performances at tasks like object recognition and scene recognition. Natural and artificial neural networks share a few characteristics, one of them being that both systems process sensory information through stages. They are both said to be deep neural networks. The largest artificial neural networks are composed of a few billion parameters. The human brain, on the other hand, is made of about 1,000 trillion synapses, the equivalent of parameters. As natural species exhibit different architecture, artificial neural networks also exhibit different structures, and to date, there are many types of species of deep neural networks with different rules of learning, supervised, unsupervised, semi-supervised learning, reinforcement learning, and so on. So in this lecture, I will give an overview of the basics of the convolutional neural networks, or CNN, that are artificial neural networks made of modules called layers, which is each layer composed of units of our artificial neurons. So let's look at the skeleton of a typical artificial neural networks, called a convolutional neural networks, or CNN. A CNN is made of multiple layers, each implementing signal and image processing function. The figure illustrates the original architecture of a CNN for visual object recognition, nicknamed AlexNet. AlexNet is composed of 8 layers, some implementing one function only, layers 3 and 4, and some implementing different functions in succession. Layer 1 and 2 are made of first of a convolution, then max pooling, then normalization. A key function of a CNN is its convolution, here shown in the orange boxes, which is implemented in most of the layers through the whole network, here the 5 layers of AlexNet. Each layer is composed by feature detectors that receive through input and pass the information to the next layer. The structure of an artificial CNN has some resemblance with the pre-made visual system, which also processes incoming visual information through layers. We will come back to the comparison between human visual brain and artificial neural networks later in this lecture. First, let's see how a convolution works. The convolution operation performs a summarization of each region of the image or the matrix. For example, imagine a flashlight covering a region of 3 by 3 pixels directed over the top left corner of an image and moving. The flashlight can slide across the entire image, covering a new region with each movement. In this example, the flashlight is known as a filter, or a neuron, or a kernel, which is an array of numbers, weights, and the region it is projecting light over is called a receptive field. The sliding motion of a flashlight over the whole image is called a convolution. As the filter is convolving, it is multiplying the values in the filter with the original pixel values of the image and summing these values. In the example on the left, for each of the 4 by 4 pixel region and for 3 color channel, RGB, we can see a single number can be produced. 443 is the matrix. With the flashlight filter moving through all the region, a new feature map is created of a smaller size than the original image. Importantly, you can stack different convolution modules as illustrated here. Therefore, as more convolution layers are added, the region of the input image analyzed by the given unit or its receptive field increases. This gives to the neural network an important property for visual recognition, tolerance to spatial position of a feature or pattern in the image. So here I illustrated 2 main advantages of stacking the operation of convolution from layers to layers. First, it increased the size of the receptive field, akin to the observation that biological neurons exhibit receptive fields that increase in size between early visual area and late visual area. The neurons in later layers of an artificial neural networks also show larger receptive field. Larger receptive field provide tolerance to spatial translation of features or shape in an image. This means that the little layers in an artificial neural networks will be able to discriminate a pattern, a circle, a corner shape, independently of the location of that shape in the original input image. Second, transforming an output of a previous stage into another through learning, we're going to see the learning rule in a minute, give to the network the ability to disentangle at each step the factor of variation underlying the input-output data. As a result, the neuron in the networks learn to represent more complex visual patterns as layers depend. For example, in layer 1 of AlexNet, neurons are tuned to features such as contours and edges, while in layer 2, neurons are tuned to curvature and repetitive patterns. In deeper layers, such as the layer 4 and 5, the neuron become tuned to part of objects and images, such as shape and form. So I just said the network learns. What does it mean for an artificial network? A program to learn. So we're going to see next some basic of CNN learning and training. And the little movie here shows an illustration of what we call backpropagation, a rule of learning. So here's a cartoon of a neural network. This cartoon neural network is made of layers of neurons or units. Here we see 4 layers of 4 neurons each. So the network receives an input, here an image of a work arch, and produce output that are related to the task we want the network to solve. And here, let's say we want the network to solve the task of classifying the image into a category. Is the image a kitchen, a garden, a work arch, or a street? The input that is shown here is an image, but it could be a video, an audio track, a drawing, a sketch, or other type of data, like neuroimaging recordings. The goal is to teach the network to recognize the category of the image. At the beginning, the neurons are connected at random. Each line that you can see here is a connection with a certain strength. The first time an image is shown, the weight between the units are set randomly, and it defines a set of connection between the neurons that end up, in that case, for instance, giving the output kitchen. Well, kitchen is an error. It's not what you want the network to answer. But it is the first time the network is shown an image and you did not teach anything yet. To teach the network, you have to tell it the right answer, and it's called supervised learning. How do you tell the network the right answer? Let's see, the networks give you 1 for kitchen and 0 for the other categories. Well, what you want is 1 for work arch and 0 for the other category. Here I show a caricature version. A working network will give a probability for each category between 0 and 1. Next, you take the answer that the networks give with the wanted answer and take the difference. You add up the square of the difference between each component that give you the overall cost of the difference for this image. In a process called backpropagation, the cost is sent backward through the network to change the weights of the connection using that cost. And this allows to re-weight the value of unit for that image. This allows the network to iteratively calculate error values for each layer and update the network parameters. If you have a very large network, you can imagine having billions of parameters that will need to be updated. Repeating this process for thousands of work arches images and averaging the result, this gives the total cost of the network for that category. You keep showing images until the network learns the right label for different type of images of work arch. In the meantime, you also show many images of other categories to learn the other classes like kitchen and street and so on. Using the supervised learning approach, very deep neural networks can learn to recognize thousands of object categories and hundreds of place categories. After the network has learned, you can test it with a new image it has never seen. This black propagation algorithm from LeCun and Benjo, 1995, is able to find a solution to high-dimensional discrimination tasks, such as learning the most useful features that recur across all the examples labeled work arch, in order to distinguish a work arch from hundreds of overseen categories. During that process, each layer learns more complex features, from contours to patterns to shapes and objects. While it remains contentious if a biological networks like the brain use a backpropagation function to learn feature matching between inputs and class of outputs, supervision signal can be triggered in the real human brain from different external and internal sources of reinforcement. For instance, the context provided by different sensory modality, direct verbal or tactile supervision, comparison with memory trace. Now that we have taught a network to recognize images, what can we do? Well, we can look inside the network to see what it has learned and see what each unit is responding to. How can we do that? So there are many methods out there that allow to visualize every single unit of your networks. In an original work that we did in my group in 2015, we took a data-driven experimental approach that allowed to dissect the entire artificial neural networks to see what every single unit has learned. The data-driven approach is inspired by neuroscience. Neuroscience is a field of study that is used to study black box, like brains. The basic idea is that you show a specific image or pattern to a brain while recording the response of a cell. Then you show another pattern and record the response of the cell again, and so on for many patterns and many cells. So the advantage of applying this data-driven approach to artificial neural network is that you can show a lot of different patterns, almost an infinite number, and record the responses of all the units in the networks many, many times in an exhaustive manner to try to determine what every single cell in your network is sensitive to. In this work, we used two AlexNet networks. One was trained to recognize object classes using ImageNet, a large-scale data set of images. And the second network was trained to recognize scene category using places, another large-scale data set of images. And this allowed to compare what each network has learned depending on the task it was supervised to do, object classification or scene classification. So here is our method. We apply a random patch to all regions of an image, a sliding window that hides a part of the image, one little window at a time. Here is our pipeline for estimating the receptive field of each unit of the network. Remember, the goal is to identify which region of an image leads to the high unit activation in our network. So each sliding window stimuli contains a small randomized patch at different spatial locations, as I've shown you. And we compare the activation response of the sliding window stimuli with the activation response of the original image. We feed all the occluded images, about 5,000 here, into the same network and record the change in activation as compared to using the original image. If we see a large discrepancy, it indicates that the given patch is important for that unit. So what we obtain is a discrepancy map for each unit and each image that is shown. Here are shown as example the discrepancy maps for one particular unit one of the 1,000 units in the network. And this unit responded to the highest two regions with curvature features in those 10 images. Then we can consolidate the responses, the highest responses to several image and region. We recenter the discrepancy map and average the calibrated maps to generalize a final receptive field for that unit. In that case, there is a specific unit in the network that is sensitive of the shape representing that ring wherever it can be found into an image. So remember, we have two networks. One trained to do object recognition using ImageNet, the other trained to do place recognition using places. We can see here that each unit likes the most. And this is for layer 1. The image patches correspond to the top activation region inside the receptive field. So here we see a visualization of what each unit likes. And in both networks, it seems that the units are made of units that respond to oriented line, single pattern, very few small region patches in the image. So that's for the layer 1. For the second layer, which receive inputs from the first layer, the unit tend to process larger region in the image, as we can see on the receptive field representation, and more complex pattern as well, like the grids and other simple forms. In the layer 4, which receive input from the third layer, now we see that the unit tend to process an even larger region of the input image. And the patterns looks like object parts. We see dogs, we see the circle, colors, faces, corner of places. So as the layer go deeper, the receptive field gradually increase and the units respond to more semantically meaningful patterns. And here are examples of unit responses in layer 5 of AlexNet. We see even more the emergence of units that have learned more complex shape objects like faces. So we see that a lot of interpretable visual concept object detector emerge inside the internal representation of the unit. And in fact, there are more object detector emerging inside a network trained to recognize places than a network trained to recognize objects. And this is a very interesting observation. We train a network for scene and place classification, and we got more object detector inside that network. This also makes a lot of sense. Objects make the meaning of places. So the neural network discovers the hidden knowledge about the environment to solve the scene classification task. And that knowledge are object parts. This means that the place network has learned a lot of object detectors for free. Since the initial work, the process of network dissection has been automatized and generalized, so you can apply the network dissection toolbox to your preferred trained network. It will show you what every single unit of your network is processing. A similar experiment can be done by training now the same network with the same data set, but to solve different tasks. Here, network was trained to solve scene categorization, and another AlexNet using the same images was trained to solve action categorization tasks. And as an illustration, I show the unit responses that emerge when training on action task. Those units that do not emerge when training on scene task with exactly the same data set. So this illustrates that the concept that emerge in the deep artificial neural networks do not just identify common patterns in the data, but instead find discriminative features that are relevant to the categorization task. Another set of experiments we can do is we can see how each unit preferred representation changes when a trained network is retrained with different images or retrained to do a new task. And this is called fine-tuning. What happens to the neuron when they relearn? So here is a network that was trained on ImageNet to perform object recognition. And I show a unit that seems to recognize parts of dogs. If we retrain and now fine-tune this network to recognize places, what will that unit be sensitive to? So you can see that over the iteration, the unit changes its preferences from dog to something about a scene, in that case, waterfall. Not the similarity in features. Here is another example. Now we can take a network trained on places that seems to respond to something like stripes. What will that unit learn to represent when it is fine-tuned on ImageNet to perform object categorization? Let's see. Go from stripe to mosque and finally ears. There are a lot of theoretical and experimental works to be done to characterize how particular knowledge are forgotten or not when teaching new tasks to a trained network. But this sort of visualization can offer valuable insight in how and why the network has forgotten or not forgotten some particular information. So artificial neural networks offer a sort of synthetic brains that we can compare to real brains. We are entering a new era of computational neuroscience, with hundreds of articles in the past 5 years, which have looked at the many ways artificial and natural networks are comparable, different, and how we can use artificial neural networks to learn about how a biological neural networks may wire, learn, store representation, forget, and so on. In one of the original work comparing human brain and deep artificial neural network that we did in 2016, our aim was to evaluate the correspondence between human brain response to visual image and artificial neural networks response to the same visual image. For the human experiments, we put people in an fMRI scanner and presented many times 118 different images of objects, one image at a time for half a second, and we recorded the brain response. So here is an example of the method we use. To analyze the brain data, we used what we call a Similarity Searchlight approach. We can move a spherical of cortex patches searchlight through the brain volume to select at each location a local set of voxels. For each voxel and image, we can have a vector that corresponds to the activity of that patch. The goal is to build a matrix of dissimilarity between pairs of image responses. So if in our experiment we had 118 images, we have dissimilarity matrix of 118 by 118 pairwise distances. That give us how dissimilar to similar the fMRI responses for pair of images are. So if you have 100,000 patches, we have 100,000 matrices. Second, we take a deep neural network, here AlexNet, trying to recognize objects. And we present to that network the 118 object images that we show to people in the scanner. Similarly, we can extract the responses for each layer. So if we have a network of 8 layers, we can extract responses over all the units of that layers for all our images shown, and also build a matrix of dissimilarity. So if we have 8 layers, we have 8 matrices of similarities out of the model. So now we have a lot of data organized in similarity matrices that we can compare. And we can compare by taking the Spearman correlation between each matrix from each layers. Representational similarity analysis, or RSA, from CRISPR-Gorty allow to compare responses and outputs from different sensor and data sources by looking at how close or far the responses of stimuli are. So here, I show these Spearman correlation. We call them spatial temporal maps of correlation between human brain and model layers. I'm going to show them here on an inflated brain. So in those inflated brain example, we see two hemispheres. So let's localize what we are looking at. Where you see the map, this is the occipital visual brain. The visual ventral region are at the bottom, and the parietal one will be at the top. When I start the movie, you will see how the correspondence between the early to late layers of the model match the best the visual brain from occipital to ventral to parietal region. And you can see a snapshot of each model brain map on the right. Red is where the correlation between the similarity matrix of the layer and a region of the brain is the highest. I can refer you to the paper for all the details. As we can see, the correlation between model layers and brain follow a hierarchy from low-level visual area to higher ventral and parietal area, showing a similarity in representation at the level of the RSA network between human brain and deep artificial neural networks. So to conclude, biological and artificial neural networks are like the two faces of the same coin. Deep neural networks, both biological and artificial, can differ considerably in their architecture, circuitry, their learning rules, their objective function or task. However, both biological and artificial networks use an iterative optimization process to pursue an objective given a lot of input data. Their comparison can help studying the implementation that works best for performing specific tasks, exploring the alternative that have not been taken by biological systems because you can create many species of artificial neural networks. Can also take inspiration from biological neural networks fits and see how we can build better artificial neural networks. And also, most importantly, those sort of comparison can also allow to create a new field of expertise, cognitive, clinical, social, perceptual, computational experimentalists working on synthetic brain or synthetic neuroscientists. If you are inspired by exploring how human neuroscience data and deep learning model code can work to dissect the network or to study how those two types of network can inspire each other, you can find a lot of data and information on the website.